Hey everyone, welcome to my very first tier list. You know, with Final Fantasy XVI right around the corner, this just seemed like the perfect time to rank some Final Fantasies. So my idea going into this was, I kind of wanted the tier list to look like a standard deviation curve when I was all done. The idea being that this would make me really have to think about how I want to rank these titles. So yeah, with all that being said, I guess let's get started. Okay, so what a way to start. Final Fantasy VIII is the first on our list, and I really do hate starting as a negative, but for me, this is a D-rated game. So the thing about Final Fantasy VIII is I really didn't like the draw or the junction system. I thought these made the game pretty repetitive and a bit of a chore to get through. But not only that, it also had a level scaling feature, which made the combat kind of pointless. You don't even need combat for money because another system takes care of that. So it's almost like, what are we doing here? Why am I playing? It wasn't for the story, that was a confusing can of worms. The characters, well, they are basically just there to tell Squall where to go and what to do. And I honestly never felt any attachment to any of them. Besides Laguna, but he's barely in it. So yeah, not my favorite. Okay, so next up is Final Fantasy XI, and I sunk in thousands of hours into this game. I like this one quite a lot, and so I think it easily goes into the A tier. So this is a little bit of a weird one to talk about, because the game I played and loved isn't the game available anymore. If you wanted the same experience that I had, you'd need to hop onto a fan server to emulate it. Two popular ones I know of are Eden and Horizon 11. So what I loved about Final Fantasy XI is that you had to fight for every inch. You had to claw your way through every level, every mission. Even traveling to different areas was a huge undertaking. And so that made even the smallest victory a massive achievement. And if you managed to get to level cap, you had an amazing journey that you could look back on. And when I do look back on it, I can't help but smile. Okay guys, so next up we are looking at Final Fantasy XV, and you know, I thought that this one was pretty decent, so I'm gonna put it into the C tier. Okay, so with this one, I felt like it didn't need to jump on the open world bandwagon. There wasn't really a justifiable reason to make the world that big, and I felt like the game suffered because of it. I actually thought it got much better in the second half, when it became more linear. Now, something that was excellent is the friendship between the main characters. I just loved how they developed throughout the game, and going on a road trip with your best friends was a great way to do that. I just wish the story didn't feel so disjointed, and I know that the DLC filled in many of the gaps, but I shouldn't have to pay extra just to be able to understand the story. But you know what, when you consider that this was a 10-year-long project with a hellish development, the fact that we got a decent game out of it was a miracle. Okay guys, so the next title in our list is Final Fantasy V, and you know, I think this is a really fun game, and it easily goes into the A tier. So Final Fantasy V took the job system from Final Fantasy III and improved on it basically in every way. The big innovation was that you could use an ability or trait that you learned from one job on any other job. This made trying out and mastering different jobs very rewarding. It was also a lot of fun going into combat and trying out different jobs and abilities, seeing what overpowered combinations that you could come up with, and whenever you unlocked a new job, it was always exciting. Now, I did feel like the story and characters were put on the back burner for this one, but hey, it was still a fun journey, and the combat did a lot of heavy lifting. So yeah, it looks like Final Fantasy IV After Years is our next entry, and right into D tier it goes. So Final Fantasy IV After Years was created as a cell phone game where each tale was sold separately. You could probably draw your own conclusions from that alone. So one of my biggest issues with After Years is they repeated many of the same plot points, dungeons, and boss fights from Final Fantasy IV. And if that wasn't enough, there's also a ton of backtracking. For example, you go through the underground waterway like 6 times. And you know, I am sure this was a consequence of selling all the tales separately. Another negative is I played the Steam port, which was not a very good port, but it was all I had access to, and in this version the combat felt very slow, and navigating the menus was clunky due to input lag. And with combat as frequent as it is, it really wasn't a very good time. Anyways, that's not to say that everything was bad. There were some fun character moments, and the band attacks were a fun addition to the combat, but when it's all said and done, it was a struggle for me to finish this. Alright, so it looks like Final Fantasy XIV is the next one we're going to be looking at, and I'm sure this will be coming as a surprise to no one, but this one is going right into the S tier. So, I think that Final Fantasy XIV is one of the best in recent years, and even the godfather of the series, Hironobu Sakaguchi, praises this one, and I think that says a lot. Now for me, this game just has everything that I want in a Final Fantasy. When I play a Final Fantasy, what I'm looking for is a compelling narrative, filled with awesome characters, incredible music that just brings out your emotions, an amazing world to explore, and engaging combat. Final Fantasy XIV does all of those things, and does them all very well. And I really like that it's an MMO. With Final Fantasy XIV, we get all of the elements that make a great JRPG, combined with all the cool aspects of being in an online world. This is a fantastic entry to the series, and my biggest regret is that it took me so long to play it. Okay, so now we are looking at Final Fantasy IX, and I think this is another A-tier Final Fantasy, bordering on S-tier, but I really feel like I need to put it into A. So, with Final Fantasy IX, it was really awesome to return to a medieval setting and have a cast of characters that weren't being led by a silent, brooding, emotionally damaged lead. This was a more lighthearted story, and it was sorely needed. And that's not to say that there weren't any serious or dark moments. There absolutely were. Like, when you learn about Vivi and the Black Mages, it's some really heartbreaking stuff. There were really only a few things that brought the overall experience down a little bit for me. One is, I didn't like that you learned abilities from equipping gear. This often led me to keep on older pieces of gear, even though I had upgrades, because I was still trying to learn an ability, and I always thought that that felt bad. The other thing was that the battle speed is pretty slow, even if you bump the speed up to the max. These are all nitpicks for sure, but when you're trying to decide between S tier and A tier, nitpicks are probably all there will be. Okay, so Final Fantasy II is our next game, and this is not a game I enjoyed all that much, so it will be our next resident in the D tier. So what brought this game crashing down for me was the level progression system. It was just so repetitive and tedious. So in Final Fantasy II, you no longer gain traditional levels. Instead, your stats are increased by using them in combat. For example, your strength can increase from attacking, your HP and stamina can increase from taking damage, and that's how you go about raising all your stats. There's also another progression system for weapons, and that can be frustrating because if you get an amazing weapon of a type you've never used before, well, then get ready for more grinding. By the way, it's the same with magic. All magic starts at level 1. Even endgame magic like Ultima is useless unless you grind it up, which feels bad when the strongest magic in the game starts off hitting weaker than the magic you got at the start. And the worst part about this is that the best way to grind is by staying in combat with a weak enemy and attacking your own party members over and over again. Because that is the quickest way to gain stats, it's a very boring and tedious way to progress, and made playing this one a real chore. Well, now we're looking at the game that started it all, Final Fantasy, and I'm gonna put it into the C tier. So, Final Fantasy is a very basic game. There's almost no story, the 4 main characters have no development or even a personality, and NPCs are all just there to point you in the right direction. But that's kind of what you expect for an RPG on the NES. With all that being said, it's still a fun game to play and figure out, and I enjoyed exploring the world. And the combat, while very simple, is still satisfying turn-based combat. It still feels good gaining levels and powering up your characters. I just think that the series has improved a lot since Final Fantasy, which is why I put it in C. Alrighty then, where to place Final Fantasy VII, one of the most influential JRPGs ever created. Maybe this will be a bit contentious, but for me, this is B tier. And just to be clear, I really do like this game a lot. The only negative I can think of is the graphics. They aged kind of poorly. But the combat, the story, the complexity and customization of the materia system, all of that stuff is fantastic. It's really just a matter of enjoying other games in the series a little bit more. And so now we come to Final Fantasy VI, my favorite game of all time, so of course it's going to go right to the top of the S tier. So, if you could distill everything that I want out of Final Fantasies into one game, this is what you'd get. It masterfully weaved together characters, narrative, exploration, combat, and villains. Also, when it came to exploration, the second half of the game becomes more of an open world, and it does it better than a lot of games do today. The last thing that I wanted to mention is, when I replayed the Pixel Remaster, I actually became teary-eyed multiple times. This is just such a pure game to me, and even after all these years, it's still just as magical. So, Final Fantasy X-2 is a game that I am ashamed to say that I judged before I ever played it, and that was a mistake on my part because it turned out really good and easily goes into the B tier. So, when I first saw footage of this game, and we saw Yuna as a gun-wielding pop icon, I honestly didn't think it would be for me. It was just so over the top and silly looking. And so I put off playing it until the HD remaster on the PS4, and I have to say, this game is a lot of fun, and the complete shift in tone made it its own unique thing, not just something trying to capture what Final Fantasy X already did. What really elevated this game for me was the combat. They brought back the ATB gauge and had a really fun spin on the job system, which they call dress spheres, and you can actually swap between multiple spheres in combat with a very Sailor Moon-like cinematic. So the combat is fun, fast-paced, and with their spin on the job system, there is a ton of customization. I guess the big takeaway is Final Fantasy X-2 is an over-the-top, lighthearted adventure with very fun combat, and I thought it was a really good time. Okay, so next up is Final Fantasy IV, and this is another classic from the 16-bit era, and for me, it's easily an A-tiered game. So the story and characters in Final Fantasy IV, I think that they still hold up even today. It's a story of redemption, with plenty of betrayals and plot twists along the way. And the pacing is really good. You're always moving forward, and there really is never a point where you need to grind. Also, the plot calls for your party to change many times throughout, and I thought that kept things interesting, because every character came with their own unique abilities, so whenever they joined your party, they brought something interesting to the combat, and whenever they left, you really felt the loss. The only real nitpick I have is there are a few too many fake-out deaths and betrayals. I thought it got a bit comical, and I am sure that wasn't the intent. So now we're looking at Final Fantasy X, and yeah, this is another S tier for me. So something that really stuck out to me with Final Fantasy X is how different the story hits when you know where it's all going. I think the writers did a really good job with foreshadowing, and I really think this one is worth replaying because of that. Now, when it comes to the combat, they return back to basics, and by that I mean it's fully turn-based. But it's not as basic as your party goes and then the enemies go. Relative speed matters, and there are ways to mess around with that. With enough speed and planning, I've had battles where my party would beat on an enemy like 12 times in a row. Another surprise to me is I actually enjoyed the alternate leveling system here. In the past, whenever they've deviated from traditional leveling, I've not been a fan. But the sphere grid is actually pretty great. It offers a bunch of customization and branching pathways, and I really like that you have full control over the relative power of your characters. I guess my only real nitpick for this one would be the minigames kind of suck. They are all time-consuming, some of them are very frustrating, and they all feel required because that's how you get your ultimate weapons. But everything else is done so well that this didn't really have any effect on my overall enjoyment. Alright, so now we are looking at the infamous Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, and I am just going to lump the first two together because I basically feel the exact same about them, and for me, they both go here, with 13-2 having a slight edge, because I do think it's a little bit better. Alright, so the way I see it is the first two games of this trilogy are completely serviceable. I never felt like it was a chore to get through them, and I actually enjoyed the combat. I thought that the paradigm system was pretty cool, and there's an energy and style to it that I thought was really fun. But I can also understand why some players didn't like it. It does have a bit of an auto-battle feel. Now, when it came to the story, the characters, and the world, there were moments that I enjoyed, but overall, I never became all that invested, and I kind of blame Final Fantasy XIII for that. It did a really poor job with delivering the narrative. So much of the dialogue was terminology that made no sense, and I think it would have helped to have a fish-out-of-water character to feed exposition too. And 13-2 had the same sort of appeal to me, the big difference being that the areas were more open for exploration. By the way, the Crystarium was a really lame version of the Sphere Grid. I felt like it served no purpose. It was completely linear, all branching pathways led to dead ends. It just felt like busy work, and I think having the different paradigms leveling normally would have worked just fine. Lightning Returns, on the other hand, I liked quite a lot, so I think I'm gonna put that into the B tier. So, in Lightning Returns, you are in a race against the clock to save the world, and I thought that made playing this one very exciting. The stakes were high, and you felt on edge the entire time. This made learning how to navigate the world quickly and efficiently very rewarding. And for the combat, you only have lightning for this one, but they went with a much more action-oriented system. You can move lightning freely around the battlefield, and you are rewarded for good timing and strategy. It also has a system similar to Final Fantasy X too, where you can change your outfits to gain different abilities to exploit weaknesses. And it's very satisfying when you figure out the best and fastest ways to take out your enemies. My nitpicks, much like the first two games, is I still didn't connect much with the story or the characters. But this time around, I had so much fun exploring the world, and I genuinely enjoyed the combat. Alrighty then, before going into Final Fantasy III, I think I'm going to upgrade Final Fantasy XV to the B tier. After going through all these games, I started to feel like that's where it belongs. Now on to Final Fantasy III, the last of the NES games, and I'm going to put that into the C tier. So this is another classic turn-based RPG that introduced the job system that Final Fantasy would become known for. Personally, this is my favorite one from the NES generation. I really enjoyed exploring this game's world, I thought the combat was a lot of fun, and the story and characters, while very simple, there was still a lot of charm there. So the big nitpick I have is that quite a few of the jobs are not good. And in Final Fantasy III, leveling and mastering jobs doesn't give you new abilities to swap around, so there really is no reason to play anything other than the most powerful jobs, unless you want to make the game harder. Alrighty, so next up is Final Fantasy XII, and for this one, we're gonna look at the Zodiac Age, and I feel like that belongs in the A tier. So, I think that all the changes Zodiac Age brought to 12 elevated the game a lot. Like, I would say the original was C tier for me. That is how much I think these changes improved the game. So, one of the biggest changes is the addition of the job system, and I thought that made playing this so much more enjoyable. I love all the customization that a job system brings, not to mention the replay value. In the original, everyone had the exact same license boards to fill out, essentially making everyone a carbon copy of one another. I like being able to specialize my party. I think it's a little boring when everyone is the same. It sort of defeats the purpose of having a party. I also love the added speed mode. Being able to move and fight at 2x or 4x faster than normal, it's a godsend for this game. Some of the zones are huge, and sometimes you have to travel through multiple zones to reach your destination. 4x speeds makes traveling so much better. It also makes going through dungeons and exploration that much more enjoyable. It's the same thing with combat. In the original, I thought it felt pretty slow, especially considering the gambit system mostly automated the entire thing. When you crank the speed up to 4x and watch your party quickly and efficiently destroy the enemies, it's very satisfying. Also, I think Final Fantasy XII's endgame activities are some of the best in the series. There are a lot of high-end hunts to do, super bosses to defeat, plenty of hidden areas to explore, and lots of powerful gear to find and craft. The only real nitpick I have is I didn't like the direction that the story went. I was hooked with the dark and realistic war drama at the start, and by the end, it feels like a completely different story. So it looks like the last game for our list is Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, and for me, this is another C tier. So, Revenant Wings is a much more lighthearted adventure, especially when you compare it to the darker themes of Final Fantasy XII. It had a very similar shift in tone that we saw in Final Fantasy X-2. The combat was interesting. It was basically an RTS-RPG hybrid. But it's a very simple take on the RTS genre, and I was also never challenged by the combat. But then again, I've also played plenty of RTSs before. The other thing is, I felt like the combat was kind of slow. I would have loved to seen a 2x option for it. With that being said, I think the simplicity and the tuning was due to the limitations of being on the DS. I sometimes found it to be a challenge to select the units and move them the way I wanted to, and I think if the game was too demanding, it would have become very frustrating to play. Overall, I thought it was pretty good, and I actually would love to see Square take another stab at creating a Final Fantasy RTS. Alright guys, so to end this video, let's just make sure that the tier list is in the order that we want it. In the S tier, we have 6, 14, and 10. I think that order is fine, I'm happy with it. In the A tier, we have 11, 5, 9, 4, 12. The only thing I can think of is maybe shifting around the order of 9, 4, and 12. But I think I'm happy with it right now. In the B tier, we have 7, 10, 2, Lightning Returns, and 15. Yet again, I'm pretty happy with the way that order is. In the C tier, we have 1, 13, 2, 13, 3, and 12 Revenant Wings. Here's where we're going to make some changes. I think 3 goes right into the front of this list, because I do think it's better than 1. And I think Revenant Wings goes in front of 13. Yeah, now I'm happy with the C list. The D tier, 8, After Years, and 2. Honestly, I think 2 is better than After Years, so yeah, that's gonna be the order now. Anyways, that's it for this video. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, please consider leaving a like, commenting, and subscribing. And until next time, bye!